until the 90s, right before 9/11, 9/11 shifted everything in the American Muslim community, even what I'm talking about now. But up until the 90s, the perspective was this, that when it comes to faith and politics for the American Muslim community, what is the best approach is what was called in the Black American Muslim community healthy patriotism. Not patriotism, healthy patriotism.
This acclaimed series invites distinguished public figures to engage in moderated, respectful, and thought-provoking discussion. We tackle controversial and difficult subjects of interest to the Jewish community and well beyond. This season is framed by the question, where is our country headed? We are exploring these issues that frequently have Americans divided about the direction of our country, our laws, our faith, our media. Tonight, we will focus on the intersection of faith and politics. How do religious leaders today navigate deeply divisive issues, the Middle East, gay marriage, immigration, and much more, in their own communities? We will ask if faith and politics can be separated or if they are fundamentally intertwined. Our panel this evening is simply stellar and amazing.
What an honor it is for me to be sitting on the stage with Rabbi Pesner and Dr. Abdur-Rashid and Reverend Ramos. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. And ladies and gentlemen, I just want to start by striking this note. We all know that we're living at a moment of tremendous moral and spiritual, religious and political challenge. Not just we here in the United States, but globally, and in a particular way, perhaps, in the nations of the North Atlantic. And one of our challenges as people is we don't often have the language or the situation in which to ask the harder and deeper questions about the condition that we're experiencing. And so we're moving along, so many of us, with a kind of low-grade feeling of anguish, perhaps even despair, about our public life as a people. So this evening, we make a commitment to you to try to get below the surface of our condition. And there's no better way to do that than to have a conversation within the brackets of faith and politics, of religion and politics, which our hosts have invited us to do. And with these distinguished panelists, that's our challenge. Let me just set the context quite quickly. It's 20 years, really, that we've been in this condition as a people. And it's not accidental that that period of 20 years begins, more or less, with 9/11. And I suspect you remember that when President Bush outlined his responses to the tragic, criminal, painful, heartbreaking experience we had as a people, the reference that came automatically to his language was the Crusades. This crusade, this war on terror, he said, a point of reference for him as natural as a baseball reference, meaning nothing particularly large about it. But it was a very large point of reference. The Crusades 1,000 years ago were the Western culture's traumatic beginning of a new relationship between politics and religion. Because the Crusades were a holy war declared by the Pope. I'm a Catholic. This has special weight for me. And the most important thing he said about the Crusades was that God wills it. So what might have been before that the activities of state power became the activities of religious power. And when state power and religious power intersect, something new begins to happen. And in a way that we're hardly able to describe in our country, something like that happened 20 years ago here. State power and religious power coming together in a new way. God is not neutral, President Bush said in his State of the Union address after 9/11. Evil will be opposed, and God is with us. The Crusades were the instance of the first pogroms in Europe, attacks by crusaders up and down the Rhine River in which thousands of Jews were killed. Something new in Europe. And of course, the Crusades were the beginning of Europe's self-understanding in opposition to Islam. The enemy at home, Jews, the enemy abroad, Muslims, an othering, a definition of the other that soon enough set Christians against each other too. Heretics, ultimately what becomes the Protestant Reformation. Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, white supremacy, the othering of immigrants, all have their roots in this notion of sacred, political, religious state power. And we don't have to look very far to see how these old impulses are playing out. And finally, the great invention of the American imagination came about after the savage religious wars of the 17th century, the 30 Years' War especially, 1618 to 1648, when something new began to happen on this continent, when people said no to state power and religious power, joined. The great leap of the imagination that took place when Americans understood the importance of the separation of church and state. But the currents that had been set running below the surface of our culture didn't go away. And we saw that very quickly when John Winthrop, who was the articulator of the City on the Hill, saw to the excommunication of Roger Williams, whose response to that excommunication was to come up with the idea. He was the one who coined the phrase, the wall of separation, came up with the idea that the purpose of the state is to protect the conscience of the citizen, not to dominate it. And that's what makes American freedom ring so loudly in history, because it's essentially a matter of freedom of conscience. We're living in a time when that tradition is under assault because old impulses buried like a Gulf Stream current beneath our culture are surfacing again in this time of crisis. So a Muslim, a Jew, a Protestant Christian, people who are spending their lives helping congregants, friends, acquaintances, family, to grapple with this very difficult subject. So with that as a kind of introduction, let me turn to you, Khalil and Jonah and Rena, and invite each of you to set the stage for us, religion and politics, perhaps speaking out of your own situation, your own congregations, your own experiences. Rena, would you begin us off, please?
Yes. I always say that I grew up, I was fortunate to grow up in a time where I could witness a revolution being fought by people of faith. El Salvador, when the people of El Salvador rise up against the repression of the government, they did it by the faith communities that were forming in the countryside, and the Bible was considered a communist manifesto. And it was infusing in people the ideas that they too had rights. And so for me, this question is one that I don't really have to struggle with, because I see why the connection. If that faith is what we are hoping to see in the future that we yet don't have in front of us, and faith is confidence, and politics is a system of laws that govern us for the better good, then there has to be some connection. And that's my statement.
Thank you for that, and it's a wonderful point of reference for us, because the revolution in El Salvador, as is true in some other places, shows how religion and politics can be profoundly creative and not just destructive. Jonah.
It's an honor to follow your story and your history. Let me take a moment of privilege as the native son who has returned, just to say a word of appreciation and thanks to the Jewish Community Center and to Rabbi Mark Sokol and my hero, Jim Carroll. For 17 years, I was a rabbi in the greater Boston area. My children learned to swim in the pool, and I was a regular at Mommy and Me classes. Married to it, thank you very much, I appreciate that. I was the mommy, I had 4 daughters, all of whom were the me at different points here at the JCC. So it really is quite a thrill to be back. And for 17 years, I was deeply proud to lead this Jewish community in interfaith work across lines of difference through the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization to bring about more affordable housing construction, to improve the Boston public schools, and ultimately to win Romney Care, which meant that hundreds of thousands of people who had been denied access to quality, affordable health care received health care. And that was a bill, by the way, that was passed by a majority Democratic legislature, but signed by a Republican governor. It had the endorsement of the healthcare providers and the insurers. It had the endorsement of big labor, and it also had the Chamber of Commerce. And ask yourselves, folks, in this environment, what brings together labor, business, Republicans, and Democrats? And I would humbly offer it was the faith community. It was the tens of thousands of members of our synagogues and our churches and our mosques who all came together and organized. And so I learned the intersection of the hope of social movements through faith and politics here in the greater Boston area. And it's wonderful to be home. The only piece that I would add, Jim, in answer to your question, another social movement that I'm privileged to be born into. And I'm very moved because my dear friend and former neighbor, Louis Grossman, is here tonight. And I name him specifically because I wouldn't be here were it not for his grandfather, who was the founder of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, the institution I lead in Washington. Kivi was a remarkable Jewish philanthropist who, when he was a young man on his honeymoon in Florida, this is during the Jim Crow era, saw a sign. He was a Jew from Boston he had never seen before in Florida, which was at every country club that they tried to go to have dinner, the sign would say, "No Jews, no dogs." Wow. And Kivi and his wife Emily were being driven around Florida by an African-American taxi driver. And at one point, Kivi turned to the driver and asked, is this common down here? What is this? And the black taxi driver looked at Kivi and said, "They don't even bother with us." Kivi understood then what King taught, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And he became very active in the NAACP. He was actually the last white Jewish president of the NAACP. Something people forget, that the NAACP was at one time largely white Jews and black Christians. I now sit on the board of the NAA, in part because of our legacy. But he also bought an embassy building in Washington, D.C., in DuPont Circle, 5 stories high, magnificent, in the heart of our nation's capital, and donated it to the Jewish community, to the Reform Jewish movement, but with one caveat. His condition was that the building would be a hub of civil rights activity. And so it was that our founder, Rabbi Dick Hirsch, his first phone call was to his dear friend, a young, charismatic pastor named Martin, and he said, "Good news, Martin, you now have an office in Washington." King used to do his work in D.C. at a Jewish institution, which was the site of the drafting of the Voting Rights Act of 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I say all of that now that I'm honored and privileged to be the director of the center, which for 6 decades has been a hub of civil rights activity. We forget that the civil rights movement was a faith-based movement. Dr. King was first and foremost a preacher and a pastor, and he marched with Heschel and Rabbi Maurice Eisendrath, who carried a Torah in his arms. And so as we talk about faith and politics, we ought to remember that as polarized and as anxious as we are now, for Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, 2 white Jewish boys and a black Christian man who gave their lives for civil rights, there have been times in our history that were more polarized and more dangerous than what we're living through right now.
Thank you, Jonah. Another good reminder, we'll return to this question of religion and politics as a source of liberation, but the subject cries out to be looked at in a larger frame of reference. Khalil, bring us into your world and how the brackets of this discussion land in your congregations.
Thank you, thank you. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. This is my first time here in this wonderful center. I feel at home, it's beautiful, it's lovely, and this is an amazing symbol of what can happen when faith leaders and community members come together to do something better to make the world and their community a better place. So thank you so much. I come from, I was born and raised in the South. So I'm a Southerner at heart. So I was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia. And my parents were Southern Baptists who converted to Islam in the 70s. Now my father used to study the Bible with Dr. King. Mm-hmm. So he went to Morehouse College when he was 16 years old. And he used to study the Bible. But after he graduated and went to law school, he became sort of enamored with where the African American, with the Black American Muslim community that was sort of growing and developed at that time, coming out of the Nation of Islam, having been inspired by Malcolm X's transformation after the Hajj, right? So Malcolm X goes to Hajj and he finds Islam as a Sunni tradition, as an Orthodox tradition, not the Nation of Islam as an ideology, and he makes this a spiritual conversion to a global religion, but comes back and sets about the business of reforming the way he does things, but also inspires a movement that deeply impacts, African Americans in the urban, northern parts of the U.S. Who are working class, part of the inner city, and then that trickles down to other parts, southern parts of the U.S. Long story short, my parents were inspired by that. They became Muslim. They never left their Southern Baptist roots. So I was baptized as a young Muslim kid. But I also grew up in this converse family. My father went into local politics, and he worked for the first Black mayor of the city of Atlanta, Maynard Jackson. He used to work for Andy Young as well, Ambassador Young. And then my father later became the first African-American mayor of the city of Stone Mountain, the city that birthed the Ku Klux Klan, the modern KKK. He was elected in '96. And one of the things that was deeply impactful for me is seeing him as, he's deceased now. He died 1 month after Barack Obama was inaugurated in DC, interestingly enough. But one of the things that growing up in that household where my family had one foot in the civil rights movement and another foot in what was then, a very burgeoning African American, Black American Muslim community in the South, was 2 different approaches to religion and politics. So one obviously was the civil rights approach, but the other, which is sort of what's going on, which animates itself now in the larger sort of American Muslim community, and definitely that's the case with college campuses in general. But the other is the position and the approach of the legacy of Malcolm X and his wife, the late Betty Shabazz, and what that legacy produced in terms of an American Islam. that differs radically from its approach of Islam globally. And it is specifically the orientation of how religion intersects with politics, which differs also from the civil rights movement. And the approach, in a nutshell, is sort of this, that religion and faith communities must get involved with politics only to the extent that it is beneficial for equalizing the playing field for all. If you can't do that, if you can't equalize the playing field for all, then you've got another job to do, or another task to do. Furthermore, the legacy that was left for Black America, for African American Muslims in the 70s and the 80s, and up until the 90s, right before 9/11. 9/11 shifted everything in the American Muslim community, even what I'm talking about now. But up until the 90s, the perspective was this, that when it comes to faith and politics for the American Muslim community, what is the best approach is what was called in the Black American Muslim community healthy patriotism. Not patriotism, healthy patriotism. Healthy patriotism meant that your faith and your values informed your critique of the status quo, and it informed the critique of institutions of power. So that when government institutions are doing great, you support them. When government institutions are not doing great, and their laws or their policies or their legislations that don't equalize matters for people, then you don't sit back and praise them. So it's unhealthy to praise wrong when you see your government doing acts of injustice. And it's similar to a parent who sees their child doing something wrong. You love your child and you say, but honey, that's not the right thing to do. I'm a parent, my wife, we have teenagers, and a 5-year-old as well. So, that resonates deeply with me. So this was a slightly different orientation, and it's rooted in the idea that civil rights, this is strictly coming from this tradition, which wed itself to Islam in America, starting with the Black African American history tradition, and now is becoming more and more prevalent. The critique was that civil rights is great, but it's not enough. Civil rights is great, but it's not enough. Why? The critique was, the analysis is that civil rights caters to the needs of the middle class. And the plight of the poor are completely abandoned and neglected. So the history of African American Muslims in this country, from the death of Malcolm X to literally the end of, well, I would say the start of the 9/11, but it really tapered down around the middle part of the, around 2005, 2004, the Iraq War, the beginnings of the Iraq War. The history was that the plight of the poor, the plight of the downtrodden, needed to be the target, needed to be the focus. That's where you worked. And if you could make a difference in the life of those folks at that level, then that was activism at a larger political level. That did speak truth to, that was a form of speaking truth to power. So this is a very different narrative and a very different history. That the plight of the poor is the focus. That, that the gap in civil rights is that it speaks to a large contingent, but not the total contingent. That was a huge perspective in the African American Muslim community. And so that is where religion and politics sort of intersect with perceptives about, how are people in the incarcerated condition being treated? How are people who have no housing being treated? When there are food shortages and food deserts, what's going on with people who don't have health care, for example? That is where the target of activism, which intersects with the civil rights movement, but has its origins in a different pond, so to speak. So I just thought I'd add that.
Well, pick this thought up. I remember Dr. King, of course, at the end of his life was focused on the Poor People's Campaign.
That's right.
He's back.
He had moved from a strictly civil rights definition to the Poor People's Campaign, and his death, of course, while he was supporting the striking garbage workers in Memphis. Would either of you like to pick up on the threads that Khalil has put on the tapestry for us?
Yes, well, what I was thinking and listening to Khalil very closely is that activism without the word itself of actions, it would not be, it would not exist. And so, as a community organizer myself, I understand the bigger changes happen with time and with the most people involved and having very clear goals and everybody's participation. And then I face the cruel reality that some of the asylum seekers who are living because they are lesbian, gay, transgender in Central America and their lives are targeted, they need a place to stay. They need basic necessities. And as a pastor, I sometimes have to try to manage resources in a way that I can give a little bit to everyone. And have to stop from the big picture, let's bring down the system that oppresses to let's feed somebody. And it's just so clear to me that that complex problems are going to have complex solutions with different points of interest.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is a couple things. The Poor People's Campaign, interesting that you referenced it, Jim, because Reverend William Barber, who is a dear friend and a colleague, has brought back the Poor People's Campaign, branded as the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And he's very disciplined about always adding a national call for moral revival, because I think he hears the Torah that you teach, to mix metaphors, around if we are not about the poorest among us, the most vulnerable among us, I would add migrants and refugees and strangers, the very most vulnerable, then we really aren't transforming our community to be the beloved community that it could be. I lead a denomination of Judaism that is largely white, largely middle class, and skews more affluent. There's plenty of poverty in the Jewish community, there's plenty of diversity, but by the raw numbers, one of the things that we've tried to do is become more proximate. So what that means is getting our congregations to be in right relationship with communities that don't look like them, whether that's religious communities, Muslim, Christian, but also communities of color and low-income communities, so that together we can work on shared solutions to shared problems that grow out only when you're actually in relationship. One interesting growth area for us is now prison congregations. We've really gone into prison communities to try and work with people who are either of the Jewish faith or interested in becoming part of the Jewish faith, so that we are not pretending that we're outside, but that we are building proximity, and then together thinking about what would it be to be a country of repentance and transformation and not of incarceration and retribution.
It's lovely listening to the three of you, because you're all naturally putting on the table before us the positive uses of religion and politics. You're making reference to tremendous humane advances done in the name of religion and politics. Let me come at this from a completely different point of view, however. Many of us are troubled by the ways in which religion is mustered as a way of generating difference, of generating contempt. What's it like to be a Muslim leader in a time when the Arab Civil War has generated a broad conception of Islam as essentially violent? What's it like to be a Jewish leader at a time when fundamentalist Judaism can be yoked to very nationalist positions with tremendous consequences in the Middle East? What's it like to be a Protestant pastor, even though you yourself are engaged at a very profoundly humane level, but to see this Protestant movement that has become co-opted by a fundamentalist wish to return the United States to a Christian nation. Each of you come from traditions that, for all the positives, are profoundly in the grip of some pretty negative forces too. How do you address those?
I will say that it's fanatism, is the entrenchment that the beliefs are completely black and white, and there is no way to evolve and transform yourself. That is the problem, not religion per se, but this blindness. And I myself, before becoming a pastor, I was a born-again Baptist, homophobic, and now I'm a lesbian pastor openly, and just can thank those people who had the patience of thinking there was some hope in my journey for seeing it the other way. But I remember being a young person in the church that embraced me, because there were other Salvadorian immigrants like myself were coming in the 80s, and it just felt so familiar, and it was my home, and it was, of course I was going to become a member there, because it protected me from discrimination out in the wide world. And so I adopted that mentality, and I remember friends, remind me now that I was like sending everybody to hell because they were dancing, because they were going to movies, because they didn't show up on Sundays, every Sunday, and so people now, is the greatest jokes they make about how, right now is a totally different story, but I just think the root of hatred is this fanatism, this entrenchment, and this just one way in which God can be perceived, one way in which can God be envisioned, or the divine.
Would you tell us what would you say to the florist or the baker who says it's a matter of conscience for him, let's say, to not provide flowers or a wedding cake at your wedding? What do you
see business? Other friends will follow.
But the serious question is,
yes.
This is a person who's appealing to conscience and to their religion. What do you say?
Religion, and that people might not be ready yet to listen.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. Where is it that we are going to be putting our energy, our effort? Is it going to be confronting that person who cannot even see me?
Right.
Or is it before me in the relationships, the right relationships with the people who are ready to be allies? And yes, some other might come along, but I don't think that that person is ready.
This is so true. The fact of people being ready is one thing, and oftentimes it's difficult to have a rational conversation when you're dealing with someone who's looking at you with, because of so many negative representations have colored their perspective. And so, American Muslims, and particularly students, are grappling with the feeling and the sense that that they're a problem, right? I mean, literally they're walking around in many cases thinking to themselves, how does it feel to be a problem, right? Mm-hmm. And so, part of what I do is, trying to instill through programming, through community building activities, through sermons, through discussions, a sense of pride for your faith tradition. On the other hand, so much of what goes on and what's presented as it relates to Islam has been distorted because of cultural representations that have been imported overseas, from overseas, or patriarchal or ideological perspectives and opinions that have been imported from overseas and then presented as Islamic, when in reality they're not Islamic. They are part of a national perspective or cultural perspective. Right? So, and then that hate is sort of driven away. I was in a room in Dallas. I used to be a community leader of the largest Muslim congregation in North Dallas. And the cemetery that are, so there were like 24,000 Muslims in North Dallas, right? And so we were using a cemetery, and the space was the cemetery ran out of space. So our community had gotten together with 5 other local large mosques to purchase land for a cemetery. And it had gotten zoned, and, all the law, legal processes were taken care of, but then, there were these groups from different parts of the country that heard about this, and the Islamophobic rhetoric, the Islamophobic machine kicked in, and all of a sudden you had people who were saying things like, we don't want to be, we don't want Muslims' dead bodies seeping into the local river so that when we turn on our tap, we're drinking water contaminated by Muslims. I was actually in a community trying to talk to some of the neighbors, and one lady actually said to me, she said, we don't want your hazardous waste here, right? I said, ma'am, like, really? I mean, every single human being has lost somebody, And there's no way you could refer to somebody's lost relative as hazardous waste. Hold on, do you really believe that somebody's lost loved one, or even if they're not even a loved one, just if somebody's lost somebody, you refer to a human being like that? So we were at a town hall meeting. There was like 300 people there. And I was speaking to the community about this issue, that, are we really having this conversation? And this backlash over a cemetery. And it wasn't like people who weren't Muslim couldn't be buried in the cemetery. It was land for people who were deceased. And at the end of the day, this gentleman, when I first started, I met this gentleman. He had on a cap, and he was a veteran of World War II. He was an elderly man. And I introduced myself. He refused to shake my hand, right, at the beginning of the program. So later on at the end, he came up and he said his bit, right? He said, you people should go back to where you came from. I said, I was born in Atlanta, Georgia. I mean, what does that mean? And he said, my people bled for this country. And I said, I see you're a veteran. And he said, yes, I am. And my father was in this war, and my grandfather served here. And I said, well, I want to thank you for, your service to our country. My great uncle was a Tuskegee Airman. And he received his Purple Heart from President George W. Bush on his deathbed. And his eyes, this man's eyes, lit up. And do you know he extended his hand to me? And he shook my hand. It was interesting, war, right? Bridge the gap. And he said, he shook my hand and he said, well, that's all right, right? And then he said, but this country will never be a Muslim country. I was like, nobody wants this country to be a Muslim. Dude, you just want to bury some people that are dead, man. I mean, let's just agree that we can't be bigoted. The hate has gotten in often cases, and this is what our kids are dealing with, what our neighbors are dealing with, that we have enough problem with the living that we have no respect for the dead. Right? And that's the level. I mean, you talk about poor people's campaign, we gotta have a deceased people's campaign. I'm not trying to be, that's the reality that communities are doing. That's where students are coming from families that are going to college with this perspective. That's where we are.
You're reminding us of how deep into the human psyche this religious-based contempt can go. Of course, one of the great tropes of anti-Semitism is the desecration of cemeteries.
Right. Exactly.
One of the marathon bombers, his remains were rejected by cemeteries. Cemeteries touch us at pre-rational, deep levels, which is where religious bigotry resides, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so grateful that you just put those words together. I think you said religious bigotry, because I was thinking in my head, bigotry in the name of religion is not religion, it's bigotry. And you asked rightly, and we got a nice round of applause from one of the members of the audience when you reflected on the ways in which religion can be weaponized. You know, so the Jewish community in America, our origins here, you know, are famously remembered by the letter between the Rhode Island Jewish community and President George Washington, right? Where the leaders of the Jewish community in Rhode Island wrote to the president as the Constitution was being drafted still and said, are we full citizens? Like, is this different? We take for granted. Now, realizing that, you know, there was still slavery, you know, this democratic experiment had a long way to go to actually be fair, equitable, and just. But for this minority religious community, George Washington famously repeating back their own words, the words came from the Jewish leadership themselves, this would be a country that would give bigotry no sanction. And of course you are full members of American society. So I think that there is, on the one hand, a commitment to religious freedom. And look at the array on the stage, right? Part of the American experiment is, could we truly be multi-faith, multiracial, inclusive, and pluralistic? And on the other hand, there are those who use those concepts as a weapon, as with the florist and the cake maker. And the balancing act we all have to do to make sure that religious minorities and religious freedom, in a real sense, is protected, and not allowed to be weaponized to be a tool of oppression of one minority or another.
Is there a religious aspect of the discrimination that migrant peoples are facing, not just in America, but in the West generally? Do you, having experienced migration yourself, is there a way in which this conversation should address the experience of migrants as such?
For me, migration is just an innate human right. You know, civilizations have done it for the beginning of time. And so this whole territorial domination, putting walls, and, you know, started by groups using a set of rules stating that was going to be their land. But the invitation has been in any Asian book to welcome those among us who are foreigners. That is in the Old Testament. I believe that when, you know, in the New Testament, Jesus stands in exchange with the Samaritan women. First, he was crossing gender boundaries, then he was crossing ethnicity boundaries. And there's a sample there of what can be done, or what can be different. So, you know, I use, every time I hear the rhetoric of who immigrants are portrayed to be and the invasion they are committing, I just don't even find words to just say humanize people, just see people as humans. It doesn't take much. And not just for the poster child immigrant that makes it to law school and makes it to seminary and, you know, becomes a public figure, for that one that's struggling and homeless, for that one too. It's just purely human.
I think it's important for us religious people to reckon with the deep sources of discrimination that are built into religion as such. And I think we live in a time when that's surfaced as a particular problem. So the idea of the temple includes the idea of a boundary. There's the sacred space and the profane space. There's this place and that place. There's them and there's us. Religion is a part of the dynamic that sets this in motion. And what we're living through right now is a recognition of the deadly consequences that impulse to otherize, to excommunicate. I grew up in a church that said no salvation outside the church. And that changed in Roman Catholicism. You know why? Because of the Holocaust. Because the Holocaust laid bare the end of that kind of othering. There are people about whom we don't care. There are people whom we're prepared to say are not chosen of God. The opposite of that is the pluralism that you're describing, and actually that each of you represents. Can you talk about how your pluralism is coming out of, as opposed to in conflict with, your religion? What in your religion justifies your innate commitment to pluralism? What? You want to start us on that?
Sure. I mean, you know, there's a wonderful teaching that in our scriptural tradition, God created humanity out of one human. Male and female, God created them. So there is a kind of unity and gender fluidity within that first human. And we're all descended from that first human to say that we're all children of God, and that all faith traditions, from the time that the human family split off, when Abraham kind of went off in one direction, and later Esau went off in another direction, and Ishmael, and all the cousins of religious traditions, but we're all of one God, and we're all of one human family, so that none could say they were better than the other. There's an inherent tension, at least in the Jewish tradition, that I will lift up, which is this notion of chosenness. It's a paradigm of kind of traditional rabbinic text, and Jewish theologians have struggled with chosenness from the very beginning. And the way I make sense of chosenness is chosenness for mission and purpose. In other words, I know I am distinct and different as a member of the human family. I am Jewish. I am not of the same religious tradition or path that my siblings are from. But I don't believe I'm chosen because I'm better than, but rather chosen for purpose, and that purpose is a pluralistic purpose. And it goes back to that moment in the biblical text I think you were referencing, when Abraham and Sarah had this radical hospitality, right, where their tent was open at all four sides, and when strangers would approach, they would rush out to the stranger with the offering of food and water and sustenance, so that they could be welcoming in the tent. And that becomes a metaphor in us for modernity, of having a tent that's open on all sides to be a place of radical welcome. Thank you for that.
Khalil, tell us what sources in Islam you find for your innate pluralism.
I can speak to that best by talking about the sources in Islam that have been anti-pluralism that I've discovered. And the fact that, you know, I was fortunate enough to have a mentor to point that out. I, you know, had the experience where I grew up, you know, as an American Muslim, but had no idea what it meant to be a Muslim. And it was the catalyst of 9/11 that caused me to search for that. And nobody in my community could tell me anything. And I had a juvenile court judge tell me, he pulled me in his quarters and say, you know, Khalil, I've got this, I used to be a social worker in my previous life. I used to investigate child abuse cases for the state of Georgia 20 years ago. And, you know, he said, Khalil, I got this Muslim family here and their kids have been taken away. I want to write the reunification order to get the, you know, and I know they're Muslim. Are there things culturally or religiously about this family that I should take in, that I should know about so that I could take these things into consideration to help reunite them? And I didn't have a clue. I didn't have a clue as to what Islam said about parenting or how to help anybody, and it was a crisis for me. And nobody in the community could tell me, although, you know, plenty of Muslims. And that was the moment that the first moment I realized that Islam in America in the modern, in the post 9/11 era from the 90s was a religious tradition that had started off domestic, but that had been affected by the importation of some religious leaders who did not understand how to apply the text to a context. So I left, and I traveled, and I went to the Middle East, I went to Turkey, I went to seminary, I went to travel, and I learned for myself how Islam gets misapplied, misinterpreted, based on a couple of things. One, political agendas. The moment I found that that Islam becomes political, you get a political Islam. So you get Hislam, right? That's what I call it. You get a patriarchal version, you get a power obsessed version, and you get, when you have Islam, a version of Islam that is dominated by clerics who then enter into political power, you get interpretations that become instruments of destruction. Not only are walls built, but so are prisons. And so you get this, the first victim are women. The second victims are folks that are, that view things, could view things differently. Interfaith projects don't flourish because of autocratic rule and how religion gets skewered based upon that. And then when that information is exported or imported into the United States and that gets taught, that becomes a problem. So the core problem for Islam that I have found is not just an issue of hermeneutics and textual interpretation. It is the question of at what point will American Muslims speak their own language about what Islam is and stop taking cues from Muslim governments overseas. The moment that happens, then you will find a robust pluralism that has not yet been exemplified before in the United States of America. But what we fall victim to now is the fact that that we have had a recent history where the interpretation and the teachings of Islam have been imported. There's not one accredited Muslim seminary in the United States. Not one. Think about that for a second. That means religious leadership in the United States is all bred from overseas. That means either somebody's been brought in, or people like myself have had to uproot their lives. And I've spent 10 years overseas. I had to go. I had to find out what was what. The first question we're stricken with is, what is religion and what's culture? Because nobody talks about that here. It's just, you go to an Islamic center and things are done one way. You go to a different center and things are another way. I used to be imam of a Turkish mosque, if you can believe that, right? And the moment I said, okay, this is how we're going to do things here. We're in Brooklyn. We're not in Istanbul. I'm going to run things this way. First things, all the sermons are in English. You don't like it? Go back to Turkey. Done. This is how we're going to do things. Women are not going to pray here. They're going to pray here, for example, right? So what we have in the United States is an overwhelming condition of cultural Islam. The United States has not seen Islam yet. Not yet. Not yet. That's why we don't have robust interfaith alliances. That's why we don't have robust American political agendas. That's why we don't have, thriving institutions that can actually have amazing engagement with the Jewish community, right? And with the Christian community and the Catholic community. We don't have that just yet. Okay? Because the kinds of discourses that are necessary to have about the text, about what the Quran says. We teach it I could teach it at Harvard. We talk about what these things mean all day long on Friday sermons. But Boston, for example, 2 mosques in Boston don't have religious leaders. The largest mosque in Boston Downtown on Malcolm X Boulevard does not have an imam. It's the largest mosque in New England. Doesn't have one, not like Park, doesn't have one. We suffer as a community from two things. One is adequate religious leadership. Two is articulate religious leadership. Born, bred American. That's what we need. That's coming, but it's slow. It's slowly coming. And with the current condition overseas the way it is, there is no option to learn to go overseas, which I think is a good thing nowadays, right? So the Muslim community is left with a few handful of good men and women to not only lead communities, but also to speak about what Islam really says, and it's a tall order of business. And with our audience, bear with me, our audience is not only non-Muslims, they're not only they're Muslims as well. Right? Because the same kinds of things that we need to educate non-Muslims about related to Islam are the exact same kinds of things we have to educate Muslims about. What the text says. How do you live in a pluralistic environment? Why is that good, not convenient? Not why is it convenient? Not why is it politically right? Forget politically. Why is it morally the right thing to do?
Yeah, that's a very powerful statement. Now, I'm going to ask you to pick up the theme in a second. But before I do, I'd like to invite you folks to prepare your cards with questions, because I'll turn to you in a moment to invite your input. But Rena, as a lesbian pastor who's having to reshape attitudes in the church about the rights of gay folks, does anything about the struggle Khalil is describing, trying to reshape the congregation, strike you as familiar or not so?
In a way, it does. I'm going to be preaching on Sunday for a Latino church, Spanish-speaking church in Long Island, with the invitation of a pastor that feels ready to have a conversation of inclusivity in her church. And I said, are you ready to lose some of your members? And she has assured me she's ready. And one thing I do in those environments is that I tell people, you can probably recite 20,000 biblical verses, from heart. They can recite them at me and make me feel condemned, or try to. And they probably will win with just reciting them. But what I always ask people to do is, if you believe in a loving God, you will want to see me through that divine eyes. With those eyes, will you see me? Will you see me? And playing like that. So that is an attempt. And I had to do it in Baltimore for another group of Latino pastors and lay leaders of their churches. And I remember this just happened last year in June, and I remember thinking, oh my God, I already felt the Pentecostal vibe in that room. They are going to eat me alive. They're going to bring their prayers on me. They're going to try to pray the gay out of me. I was so nervous, and decided to walk that morning to the venue to just calm my anxiety. And then once it was getting near to my time to talk, I said, let's sing, because nothing is better than music, and, elevating everybody's hands, and that got us together. And then, I was so surprised. They were so right to have the conversation, to engage. I think people are getting ready. People have done work already before me to plant seeds and make it easier. And to just return to that other question of what influenced our openness, our heart to receive the multiplicity of that exists in the United States. I always think there are some Bible verses that inform that for me. Jesus said, how you will see that you're my disciples because you love one another the way I love you. So, that's going to be a sign. And I always also like that other chapter where they asking the blind man in the synagogue who had healed him. It had been Jesus, but they wanted the blind man to say, was he a prophet? Was he the Messiah? Who you will claim it to be? And the man says, I was blind, now I see. That's it. And to me, it's maybe as simple as that.
So you're both, if I might observe, you're both talking about the triumph of experience over dogma.
Yeah.
And I'm going to, at some point before the evening ends, Jonah, turn to you on that subject, experience over dogma. But right now I'd like to bring from the folks in the audience questions that we might take up seriously. It's my privilege to read the questions. What exactly is American Islam? I guess this is for you, Rena. How is it different from Islam everywhere else in the world?
Yeah, excellent question. Islam is Islam in the ritual sense. The 5 pillars, fasting, belief in, monotheism, belief in one God. The obligation to perform the pilgrimage once in your life. Giving charity. Those are the basic pillars of Islam. The rituals are the core. The American part means what is it that makes our understanding and practice of Islam as a whole different and unique from everywhere else in the globe, right? So, if you go to, I've been to Yemen, the Islam there is different. The text is the same, the practice is different. The understanding of the application of the text is different. I've been to Istanbul, very different. Egypt, completely different. Malaysia, oh my goodness, different. Saudi Arabia, absolutely different. Been to Morocco, very different, right? And each place is informed by its history, its civilization, its culture, all of these things. The difference is that has not yet happened in the United States. Why? Because the United States has 2 parts to it. One are Muslims who've migrated and immigrated from all parts of the Muslim world to the United States post the 70s and the 80s, and it increased more in the 90s. And then you've had a large African-American Muslim community that started off building an infrastructure in the United States. As a matter of fact, there was what's called a communal conversion to Islam for the Black American community, which is why, for example, when hip-hop broke out, from the Bronx in the 90s, it started off with Islamic tropes. You can have, it's common to find African-American families with an Arabic name, somebody named Khadija, somebody named, Jamal, and all, these names have settled in the Black American community. What it's lacking here, the American part, is how Islam is represented here, right? So it's got to look different here than the way it looks over there. And that's normal, that's fine. We've got to interpret the text for ourselves based upon our own context, based upon our own needs. You talked about pluralism. This has got to be at the forefront. And American Islam means an Islam that, unabashedly speaks to the fact that, Holocaust deniers, that there's no place for that in this country. Let alone in our tradition, let alone in our religion. There's no place for anti-Semitism. Not any little bit. There's no place for any kind of hate and bigotry, and that kind of frame has to be spoken from the pulpit, written about, talked about, and discussed, trained. We've got to train imams and clergy and men and women along these lines. So an American Islam is an Islam that has met not only the shores of the United States, but also the geography and the cultural and historical factors that shape Islam to allow it to be, dare I say, domesticated here. right? It's got to be appropriated here. It's got to no longer have the sense that it is an import, such that we're importing foreign ideas. We're importing our understanding of how to deal with our neighbors and deal with, construct our mosques, and import ideas about how to deal with politics, how to engage with domestic issues, national issues. All of these things have to take on our own individual flavor. We've got to appropriate Islam for ourselves. It's got to be our clothing that we're wearing. And that has to happen and has not happened yet. Clear example, look at any mosque that's built that is not an American-style architecture. It's not. Right? I'm not criticizing, it's an observation. So the way the mosque is, just the structure itself. I mean, we've got brilliant architects in the United States, Why take one model? Now you've got a different model of mosque in Morocco, different model in Istanbul, different model in the Middle East, and even Middle Eastern countries have different models within themselves. The Gulf country mosques, the mosques in the Gulf are not like the mosques, for example, in Egypt or Saudi, and they're certainly not like the ones in Yemen, and certainly not like the ones in Malaysia. Right? So why is it mosques in the United States take on one fashion? So an American Islam means that mosques in Islam should look American. You don't need to go park in the mosque and say, oh, this reminds me of Morocco. No, we're not in Morocco. Right? I mean, at some point, in our events, for example, it's great to have diverse food, and the Muslim community is one of the most diverse communities in the United States. But at some point, an American Islam means that if you woke up Monday morning and suddenly all of the American Muslims were just disappeared, and Fox News and CNN and MSNBC and the Associated Press just reported all the Muslims in the United States are gone, what would be missing? That's what American Islam is. That's our contribution to making this country better. And it must transcend kebabs and baklava and biryani and bean pie. It's got to be more than that. Cuisine's important, but bringing hearts together is more important. Making communities lively is more important. Informing our political process about that. What they're doing, what is it that they're doing that is shameful, and not how to be situated in shame, just to rise above that. You can do better. That's what an American Islam means. And we're not there yet, but we will get there.
How would you talk about an American Judaism?
I so resonated with the story because when I was a rabbi in Boston, at Temple Israel Boston, we created a partnership with the Islamic Society of Boston.
Yes.
And it was perpetually frustrating. We couldn't get a meeting with the imam. And partly it was because there were periods where there wasn't an imam, or we would hear from the lay leadership, the imam is self-conscious because he doesn't speak English. And my colleague, Rabbi Morrison, pointed out to me at the time, this is back in like 2003 or 4, he said, it reminds me of my grandparents' Judaism, which was an immigrant Judaism. There were synagogues that looked German. There were synagogues that looked Russian. They didn't talk to each other. The food was the food of the old country. And, my friend Jeremy and I were ordained from the first ever American seminary, the Hebrew Union College, which was established by our founder, Isaac Mayer Wise, to be an American Judaism. And he believed it was only when there would be a seminary, training rabbis, and then institutions like the RAC and et cetera, that we would give rise to an American form of Judaism. And I do think that I would characterize American Judaism as being this incredible intersection of 5,000 years of enduring values with 200 plus years of the very best of American democratic ideals of pluralism and inclusion. And I think it's only been strengthened and made better by the interfaith dialogue that makes American religions have something to say to the rest of the world. Because, and just back to the kind of ways in which sometimes religion can impose itself on others, one of the reasons I am adamant that I do the work that I do, the political work that I do in interfaith dialogue and relationship, is lest any one religion impose itself on the other. I am held accountable by my sister and brother of faith, so that it isn't an imposition of Jewish values in the public square, but rather, what are the shared values that can be discerned when we really struggle and wrestle together with the text and try and see a better America through the prism of our faith traditions?
Well, here's a question that really puts it to all three of you, really. And I'm going to ask you each to respond to this briefly, because we're running out of time.
Good luck.
What? I'm going to start with you, Rena. What do you see in the next generation for each of your denominations? And the questioner goes on to ask, are they more pluralistic too? Are they so pluralistic there?
Yeah.
So Rena, please.
So I come from, the denomination that finally ordained me
UCC.
was the United Church of Christ, which tends to be more progressive, more open, has ordained, the first African American, the first women, claims the first on this. And so I see it as being a force that will continue opening doors. My worry, and I have voiced it within colleagues, and also I'm part of the national staff, so there too, is that it needs to be more appealing to marginalized communities, because it tends to be, upper educated, upper class, and white, and not that many, look like me within the UCC. And I feel, after studying their polity and their history, that it is a theology of liberation that will be appealing to Latin America immigrants like myself. That will be something that resonates with them. That then people will know how to turn to the most conservative churches that give them a sense of community right away when they come, and they just embrace them and take them and then shape the way they see the world. So my hope is that the UCC looks a little bit like me.
So the next generation.
So I suspect, whoever asked the question, there may be some Jewish parents and grandparents who are really asking, will my kids and grandkids be Jewish? There's a lot of anxiety in that. So let me share two insights that may make you feel better or may make you feel worse. So I represent the largest denomination in Jewish life, according to the Pew study. There was a seminal religion study by Pew in 2012. There are 2 million people who call themselves Reform Jews. It's the second largest denomination because the largest is none, meaning Jewish with no religion. The largest denomination in Jewish life is people who there's about 7 million people who identify as Jews. The single biggest group are Jewish but no religion. What we're seeing of our young people is two things. One is there is an association with Judaism, with history, tradition, culture, food, etc., just not affiliation patterns, right? Like not joining a synagogue, like the ways in which my parents and their parents identified as Jews. But this is a generation that cares about experiences and cares about meaning and purpose, so they may just define Judaism differently, and it may not look like the Judaism that we define it as. And second, deep breath, everybody. Ready? They're very non-binary in their thinking. Okay, so I had a young person say to me, Rabbi, why are you so binary? And I'm like, I don't even know what that means. What that means is I'm either Jewish or I'm not. I'm either straight or I'm gay. I'm either male or female. This is a generation that does not think in binary categories. They consider themselves this and that, which means Jewish and Christian, black and white, male and female. This is like, go talk to your kids, people. Don't yell at me. But I do think it means that an inclusive Jewish community, and frankly faith communities, just have to be a lot more open to self-definition and meeting people where they are, and just be generous with that our tradition has something to say to people, even if they don't fit a narrow box of definition of what it used to look like to be Jewish, to be Muslim, to be Christian, to be.
I'm very optimistic And I'm optimistic because we live in, literally the best country on the planet. We have tremendous opportunities here. With all of the difficulty and all of the challenges we have, we still have an incredibly bright future ahead of us. And what I see in the young folks that I encounter are, and I don't just deal with, I deal with Harvard students, so one can argue, well, you're just at Harvard. No, number one, I have kids of my own. And I travel quite a bit and get around to talking to other groups of students as well. And overwhelmingly, I completely agree that the idea of categories is an idea that for some reason, the next generation is not wired like that. And I take that to mean that, as religious and faith leaders, what we're going to have to do to make religion relevant for this next generation is to literally think out of the box, to think out of wiring, and molding. And more and more this generation is growing up, even in religious homes, a-religious, or, with sort of that religion as an identity, but not yet a lived experience. And so I'm optimistic that the students I see are interested in trying to figure out how religion can save the world from climate destruction and all of these major issues and immigration and all of these things. They wanna mine religion for these resources.
Yeah.
That's right.
But they have to be inspired to do that, in my view. But I'm very optimistic that, being here, we are in a luxurious situation that we've got great communities, great resources, and even with our challenges and our failures, having been a social worker, I do believe that failure is one of the most profound teachers ever. And so while we have traumatic examples of failed policies and failed attempts at doing what's right, there are tremendous benefits that you can, as faith leaders, we can say, you know what, there's something there. Yeah, this is the wrong thing, but you're encountering that for a reason. So let's look at that. Don't just criticize it. No, analyze it. And we were taught in the Islamic tradition that somebody went to one of the prophets, one of the biblical prophets, and said, how did you become such a good person? And the person said, well, I just looked at the mistakes of everybody else and didn't do that. Right? So our kids are good at pointing out mistakes. What religion can do, I think, is help them analyze those mistakes.
Thank you for that. I'm terribly sorry to say that we're drawing to the time of conclusion. If I could presume to just add a last word. I began by referring to the Crusades. I remember Tony Blair, in trying to defend Islam from the assaults, anti-Islamic assaults that broke out across the Western world after 9/11, Tony Blair said that jihad and violence is no more true to the religion of Islam than the Crusades are to the religion of Christianity. Tony Blair couldn't have been more wrong, because I don't speak to or about Islam, but as a Christian, it's been very important for me and people of my generation to reckon with the fact that the Crusades came right out of the center of Christian religion. The same way in which anti-Semitism comes right out of the center of Christian religion. Anti-gay and lesbian homophobia comes right out of the center of Christian religion. And what we've engaged in tonight is three folks from different traditions speaking out of their own grappling with how to overcome the negative and inhuman impulses embedded in our religions. And what you've given us a wonderful example of is what's waiting at the end of the road for religious people who take on the challenge of reckoning. You cited the man who just observes the mistakes everybody else made and doesn't repeat them. But what you're all talking about really is looking hard at the mistakes you yourselves have made and learning from those. Religion, if it's not self-critical, is dangerous.
That's right.
Amen.
That's
Amen.
right.
And that's our
That's right.
conclusion. I want to acknowledge JCC's.
I want all of us to say amen.
Amen.